This is McDowell Creek, right? It flows into the Kansas River, and it flows south to north, which is not what you always think of for rivers. It seems so many of our main rivers flow north to south, but this one is coming out of the highland to the south of us and heading for the Kansas River. It's beautiful for one, and we love it. We love it.
Well, I think we're, finally in this day and age, we're finally starting to figure out that we need to maintain some of these self-sustaining ecosystems. I think in the past have made the mistake of thinking we can control every ecosystem to our advantage and benefit, but most of them are best, including the tallgrass prairie, is probably best just left alone. Basically what we're trying to do is repair earlier mistakes rather than, try and manipulate things.
That's right. I think when you have places like this, for one thing, these stones are like 250 million years old and from ancient seabeds. How important are the things that we can get into worrying about in a context of 250 million years? And it's not just one sea, many seas. If you look at that creek bank over there, each of those layers represents a different sea that came and went at a different time with its own climate and its own inhabitants. And we are in this context, no matter how much we try to pretend we're the rulers of the world. We're just part of this whole thing, and it's easier to rejoice when you are part of that whole big thing. Easy to get bent out of shape and worried and anxious when you are just looking at the little things that in your little immediate surroundings. So it's nice to think that this, long after we're gone, there'd be people who could sit here and feel their hearts take wings and just rejoice in creation. Well, when I first moved to McDowell Creek, I'm a swimmer, so I wanted to swim in the creek, and there were pools just next to an old low water crossing with culverts and so on. But I couldn't see very far into the water, so I'd be treading water and then I'd feel something bump against my feet, and I knew there were giant snapping turtles in the creek, and so that kind of inhibited my enjoyment of swimming in the creek because the water was so cloudy. But when Al Alspach bought the land upstream from us, he changed some of the practices that had been going on. It had been traditional to plow right up to the edge of the creek upstream from us, which meant that lots of topsoil washed into the creek, and it made our creek very cloudy, and it meant I couldn't protect myself from snapping turtles when I was trying to swim. Al put in buffers around the crop field. He didn't plow right up to the edge of the creek. He had native plants in those buffers and wildlife strips, and almost instantly the water quality changed. Good field management makes for good neighbors. And Al is just such a good field manager.
Yeah, on my part, it's good to have a neighbor who's a fellow conservationist. It makes, instead of butting heads on what's going on the other side of the fence, we're complimenting each other. And in this case, Margie and Ron have hired me to do a fair amount of the habitat improvement work and conservation work here on this property. And heck, I'm almost embarrassed to say this in Margie's presence because what a deal! I get paid to dress up to habitat contingent to mine. It's a dream come true almost, So now after saying that, I'm gonna have to lower my prices when I work for Margie.
Yeah. Well, we got ideas from Al because he put in a shrub row along our driveway, or it's the driveway we share with Al, and that was wonderful wildlife habitat. So we asked Al, well, what can we do on our side of the driveway to extend that benefit to wildlife? And so he gave us some ideas, and we ended up putting in a native plant buffer, which buffered one of our crop fields. And so we had the shrub row, and then we had native plants extending into the field. And so we had a variety. We had grassland, we had shrubland, and it was really good for wildlife. And we love seeing the wildlife. The other day I was driving down the driveway, and out of Al's plum row come this whole covey of quail. And of course I had to slow down because they were little ones and they didn't know any better than just to keep walking right in front of the truck. And so I had to creep along, but it was exciting to see those little guys. And of course then we hear the quail, and it really is delightful in our quality of life to have wildlife around.
Yeah, we fortunately our upstream presence kind of goes a little farther, and one of my partners on the farm downstream from here, Jeff Morris, also bought, I have an 80 above here, directly above here on the creek, and then he has another 50 acres directly upstream of that. And between he and I and our farm farther downstream, I believe we planted over 6,500, I believe, shrubs, largely American plum, some aromatic sumac, etc., a few others, some choke cherries, but we've done that to basically our thrust is to improve wildlife habitat, especially quail would be our main concern, but as we all know, if you improve habitat for a signature species like quail, you're going to improve the habitat for a lot of other songbirds, etc. I think it's important to point out that both Margie and I on our properties have gotten help from various agencies. The USDA Farm Service Agency has some cost share options, whether it be CRP, CP 33, etc. We've also gotten a fair amount of and continue to get help from the Pheasants Forever. We have, I believe, about 50 acres of food plots between our properties now, and I don't think we've ever had to buy any seed. Between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Pheasants Forever, or Wildlife and Parks, somebody comes up with the food plot seed for us. But I think it's, there's a lot of cost share opportunities out there through those organizations that if somebody's considering doing some habitat improvement, I suggest they look into taking advantage of that. And to me, it's almost a no-brainer, especially in this day where we're at now with crop prices being so minimal. It makes sense to put some of these especially hard to farm or marginal areas, put those into a native situation. Whether it be by contract or not, you can always till them up later if farming becomes a little more lucrative. We have quite a bit of areas when we did the riparian areas through a CRP program, planted roughly 120 foot wide native strips along our waterways, and it's just made a real boon for wildlife, water quality, and like Margie says, enjoyment of life, quality of life.
Well, a native plant buffer between agricultural land and any waterway is just huge. I would think that would be the key thing, because it's the key source of poisoning of our waterways right now is agricultural runoff. So the more native plant buffer you have, that water and everything gets recycled and trapped and also runoff from rainstorms and so on goes down into the fields so that you're more drought resistant than just having the topsoil and all the water from a rainfall wash into the creek. So those buffers are just huge. One thing that improved the quality in addition to Al's buffers, we noticed the difference immediately. And Al said, because he took a canoe down the stretch of the McDowell Creek, including where we are now, all the way on down, and he said from his property to going through ours on this stretch of creek, he was seeing all these butterflies and birds and dragonflies. Then he got down to where, further downstream, where the traditional farming is going on, and he said it was like a wildlife desert then, because so many things like dragonflies need the trees to perch in and the water to lay their eggs in, and the nymphs are aquatic. So the buffer and the stream work together to produce all of the insects that the birds are eating, and so you have this buildup of an ecosystem and a food chain. But if you just have the creek, you're not going to have all the creek creatures that need the stems and the vegetation and the trees and so on. We had a kingfisher stop by a couple days ago. He needs the tree to perch in over the creek in order to hunt the fish. And the fish need good water quality in order to be there for him to eat. And the fish need the mayflies that we can see flying around for a day or two, but then their larvae are in the creek for years sometimes, feeding the fish that feed the kingfishers and the great blue herons and so on. So those buffers, there's just no substitute for those buffers.
Well, I think a native grass / forb mix is probably the best. Margie has kind of come up with the idea, and we've been playing with it, of decreasing when we go into renovate an area, to use less grass, more forbs, because invariably the grass takes off that way ahead of the forbs, forces a lot of the forbs out. So, I think a grass forb mixture, probably light on the grass. The grass, as we've proven here, the grass is going to come anyway.
Yeah.
And I think, as we were talking earlier today, I think renovation of prairie is kind of a misnomer, or restoration at least. You can't really restore native prairie. You can renovate it, you can maybe speed up the natural processes, but I remember one seed salesman told me a quote that I'll never forget. Well, what should we put in this area? Put everything in there and let God sort it out.
Yeah,
and I think
exactly
that's the truth.
Right.
Because that's eventually what's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
As far as what we've done upstream here to improve water quality, as Margie said, the buffer strips are very important. The other thing we've done is gone to minimum tillage. I won't say it's no-till. I'm to the point where I'm doing all of my fertilization with compost rather than any synthetic fertilizers.
That's huge. That's huge.
And that compost as a fertilizer helps with soil erosion, even because the microbes stick themselves to the soil colloids and kind of hold everything together. So
helps with water retention too, tremendously.
A whole lot of water.
Whereas the synthetic fertilizers just facilitate runoff.
What I've always said about synthetic fertilizers is, yeah, you get this immediate good, bang, good, but it's fleeting. Anytime you put down a more organic fertilizer, you're doing good from now on, because that humus buildup just does a lot of good. Infiltration, water holding.
I just have to mention another thing that Al did. Shortly after we began to notice the improvement of water quality, we asked Al to take the culverts out of the part of the creek that had been used for a low water crossing in previous eras, and the culverts were channelizing the creek coming through. So the water coming from Al's place to ours was channelized through part of our creek, and that meant we had steep banks on both sides, and the water went through really fast, and that's not natural for a creek. As you can see, this is more natural here. It's natural for a creek to set up deposit stones and gravel on one side and cut the banks on the other. The channelizing was cutting the banks on both sides. So Al took those culverts out, and in the next few years, what happened was a meander occurred with big gravel banks. And this year, we had a whole bunch of a special kind of ground nesting bee that was getting minerals from that gravel bank. And the meander also allowed between Al's property and ours for a woodland to grow up. It wasn't exactly an oxbow, but it's a big curve between Al's stretch and where ours begins. And that curve became its own little habitat, and it's kind of like this peninsula island here that's full of chinkapin oaks and sycamores, and a little woodland grew up there. And so this year I was sitting by the creek, and out of the woodland flew a butterfly I'd never seen before. It's called a northern pearly, and it landed on the gravel bar right next to me. It's a rarely seen butterfly because it lives inside dense wooded areas, which the meander in the creek had allowed to grow up. And then the meander of the creek depositing gravel produced the minerals that this butterfly ventured out of the woods in order to take up, scoop up with its little proboscis. And there's nothing more thrilling than seeing creatures that maybe had no habitat before becoming your neighbor. And there's probably a whole bunch that I don't even know who they are, but that was because Al took those culverts out and the creek could renaturalize. And now we can get across the creek at a gravel bar crossing, except when the creek floods. The less we get out, the less we block what nature wants to do. It seems like the more creation happens, and you're just surrounded by this life force, which is, in a time when you can get pretty pessimistic about some developments, you can't be pessimistic when you're sitting next to a northern pearly eye. You just can't.